Hello, Tyson Carter here from IMT, and one of the questions that I get asked a lot is how do I work with comparing records in Inspector? So in IBM InfoSphere Inspector, we're going to take a look at how you go in and compare records to understand more about how they match and how they link. A lot of times we'll see two records, and maybe they come from different periods in time, or maybe data was collected quickly versus more thoroughly, or sometimes it's even a case of data was collected using a standard formal ID, like a driver's license, versus just asking a questionnaire. And so someone may answer a little bit differently with their legal name versus a nickname that they go by. When we bounce these records against each other, we have multiple dimensions that we can compare. So we might look at name, address, phone, birth date, gender, some kind of a government ID. And from there, the system will analyze those to see how well they match. And there's different categories. It could be exact, partial, missing, different, etc. All of these comparisons are yielded onto the comparison screen in Inspector. And on the comparison screen, you see an attribute by attribute breakdown of how well each of these elements scores. But one of the things you also see is a total score. And it's that total score that makes the determination in the engine whether these are the same person or are not the same person. So let's look at how this comparison process plays out in the actual Inspector tool. Here we are in Inspector, and I'm going to search for a person named Damon Araballo. And when I go ahead and search for him, there I find him, and I'm going to inspect his entity. When we look at his entity here, I can come to the Records tab. On the Records tab, I see that there are actually 4 different records on file for him that are all linked together as the same entity. If I want to compare any of these records, I can pick any 2 of them. So I'm going to start with the first 2. I'm going to check mark those 2 records and then come over here to the compare icon. When I click the compare icon, here we see a side-by-side comparison of these records. If we look at the name, we can see the breakdown of how the last name, the first name, and the middle name all fit together. If we look at the address and phone, we can see how the elements of the address compare as well as the phone. The phone is down here at the bottom where it says edit distance is 0, which means it's an exact match on phone. Now, the way that these elements fit together, if we look at the name, the first name, the middle initial, and the last name, I'm getting a score of 7.32. But if we open up the weights, we see 468, 468, and 192. That adds up to over 10 points. So when we look at this, the math is a little bit strange, but the reason why the math is strange is because these numbers here get inserted into a formula. That formula includes something called the maximum weight for name. And that maximum weight for name helps us keep names in balance so that if there's a name that's super unique, it doesn't score so many points that name alone would cause a link. Now, when we add up all of these individual weight scores, we get our total score, which is up here in the corner, and in this case is a score of 23. While we're here in the compare screen, we can actually pick any records at all to compare. So if I come in here and I look for 835.202 and I refresh that, I'm now comparing Perry Bros to Damon Arballo. I hit the compare button, and I see that in this case, these 2 people score a negative 11 against each other. Definitely not a match. Now, you may not always know the ID of a person. You also can just hit the search here, and I could search for anyone at all. So I'll look for Zhang, Shawnee, and I will add in Shawnee Zhang. and then I can hit compare. And again, in this case, I'm at a negative 14.6. So you can pick any two records in the system that you want to compare them. Now, if we come back to the screen that we were at before, I could pick a different record to see how they compare. So in this case, we have Damon Arballo III versus Damon Arballo Sr. We've got slight differences in the spelling. So if we look at how this works out, we see that the score is significantly less, from a 23 to a 15. In the case of this particular system, our threshold is set exactly at a 15. So these just barely link together based off of the information that was known. We also can see that we're getting different, or a match code of different, on the name, and we can see that there's an edit distance on the last name where one has an E and the other doesn't. The first name was an exact match, but the third versus senior is actually subtracting some points from the overall score. I want to show you an alternate way that we can get to comparing records. So instead of comparing records by doing a traditional search for an entity, we could also search at the record level. If we search at the record level, I can open up one particular record. You can see that the compare button also shows up here. And when we click compare, it only fills out one of the two compare slots. From here, we would then have the ability to look for someone else. And we can add another record to the mix and then compare. You also can compare a record exactly to itself. So, when you're in this screen and you want to compare a record to itself, that can also be done. And then you see what the perfect match score could be, because you can never score more than what you would score against yourself. It'd be an exact match on everything. You also have the ability to do a compare from the task screen when you're looking at potential linkages, potential duplicates, and review identifiers. So let's take a quick look at a task here, and I'll show you that as well. So I'm going to open up a review identifier task. One of the things that we'll see is that in this case there are only two records. These two are automatically checked. Compare does only work with two records. So if there were three or more, you might have to uncheck a couple before you can do this. These check marks also make things show up in the lower part of the screen. But if two of them are checked, we also have that same compare records button, and when we compare, we can see a more detailed view of how they play out in the analysis. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more guidance on how the compare feature works, and we hope to see you next time in our next video.